Welcome to Reimagining Anti-Violence Work, a small space where we're going to unpack the big issues currently impacting the anti-violence field and collectively dream up a new future. Hello, anti-violence workers, leaders, and anyone else that's made their way here. I'm your host, Steph Klotz, a former anti-violence worker and a member of the We Deserve Better project. Today, I'm joined by Jess Harmon, the author of A Point of View on Promoting Self-Care as a Tactic of Worker Exploitation. Jess also worked in the anti-violence field for 15 years before transitioning to a new career in mental health as a therapist. She's a social worker, volunteer, writer, trainer, speaker, and consultant. We'll be chatting about her take on self-care and where workers can disrupt this current status quo. Welcome, Jess.
Hi, Steph. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for being here and for sharing your take. So, I have to confess, I personally do love self-care. So, I need to know what inspired you to write this blog post. Do you just have a hatred for it? You just hate self-care?
Yes, I do. No, I don't. I don't think there's anything wrong with people taking care of themselves. As a therapist, I regularly encourage people to take care of themselves and to do whatever it is that they need to do to get through a day. I do have a major problem, though, with self-care as an industry, which is something that I think we're going to talk more about in a bit. But to answer your question about what's inspired me or what inspired me to write this blog post. So the example I give in the article that I wrote, which is a blog called The Inclusion Solution, which was for a international diversity, equity, and inclusion firm called the Winters Group, was regarding, there's an example regarding a nurse, but spoiler alert, I've never been a nurse. I'm way too squeamish to have ever gone to any sort of medical anything training program. But I had thought that the healthcare industry might be relatable to more people than the anti-violence field, given the amount of workers in the two fields. But truthfully, I was writing about my own experience in the anti-violence field as having been a direct service provider, working, the Friday night overnight shift in shelter in a domestic violence shelter, and then kind of working my way up of case manager, program manager, director of programs, as well as hearing the stories of other folks who I worked alongside with and them sharing those with me. And so throughout my career in the anti-violence field, I attended, and I'm sure you, Steph, probably, and people listening have attended many trainings regarding self-care and about vicarious trauma and burnout and compassion fatigue and all the buzzwords and all the things. And what struck me about all of those trainings was that there's really the focus on what we as individual workers can do to prevent our own burnout, to prevent, what comes of experiencing vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. And that there was never really any information about what organizations could do to better support their workforce. The trauma-informed care training seldomly was about creating a trauma-informed agency.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because I was the trainer at my former agency and I was tasked with creating training on vicarious trauma. And so I tapped into the National Vicarious Trauma Informed Organizational Toolkit
Mhm.
and presented on the 5 pillars of a VT trauma informed org, which are leadership and mission, right? Like mission alignment, transparent communication, management and supervision, employee empowerment and work environment, training and professional development. And then the fifth one is staff health and wellness. And, you know, I want to really be clear that that's different than self-care, right?
Mhm.
The
Mhm.
health and wellness of your staff and what you can do as an organization is different from one of the pieces of that is promoting self-care, certainly. But that's, one small little piece of these 5 pillars.
Mhm.
And so, anyways, I presented this information, and then the vice president of the client services came back to me and was like, no, this isn't what we need. We
Mm,
need a training on compassion fatigue, as a, horse by another name,
mhm.
compassion fatigue and how you can help yourself and others.
Yeah.
So still on staff to like, you know, do it yourself and each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it means that I guess we're meeting the training and professional development piece with that, right? I'm giving training on it. I'm informing people, but yeah, it cracks me up that you said that because it's like, yeah, no, I tried. And they're like, no, this isn't what we want.
Yeah, oh yeah, I completely believe that. Yeah. And early on in my career when I would attend those trainings, this didn't really elicit anything other than an eye roll from me, but as I started getting promoted and then started to be, part of those conversations, like, probably around the table, the conference room with that vice president of the org that you're referencing, and being part of those conversations, I realized it was a really explicit conversation, right? That like more than likely that vice president who came to you be like, oh no, we don't want you to talk about us. We want you to talk about you all. That those were really explicit conversations that like once I started to be a part of them, realized how concerning the conversation was around self-care and vicarious trauma amongst leadership. And so I started to hear about how leaders thought about staff who were experiencing burnout and realized that the entire conversation had this kind of ulterior motive, exactly like what you're talking about, that self-care was really being utilized as this tactic of worker exploitation. That if workers are, there's kind of like this reciprocal relationship that I was tuning into that like for staff who were kind of complicit in their own exploitation and working, the long hours and taking on the big caseloads and being self-sacrificing and doing more and more and more with little and little and little, that they, as long as they didn't complain, they were kind of deemed to be doing self-care right. But then as soon as staff started to say, hey, this isn't really sustainable. This isn't really doable. I'm like working way longer for not a whole lot of pay. Do you think I could get a raise? Do you think that I could get a lower caseload? Do you think that I could like have, so many people in the anti-violence field have a role where it's like, actually, this should really be like two or three people's jobs and not just one person's job. What if we like made it two or three people's jobs instead of just my job, right? That as soon as workers start to kind of air the impact of this, do more with less, then it's, I think that maybe you're not doing self-care right. You're not doing enough self-care. Maybe you should take some time off to take care of you, or have you attended this training about self-care that we've put together about the things that you can do? That it was only after leaving the field and reflecting on the experiences that I had had that I was really inspired to write this blog post in order to kind of process this phenomena that I think really I needed a name for myself. And in doing that, have gotten connected to the We Deserve Better project and have gotten connected to other folks in the anti-violence field or folks who've left the anti-violence field because of all of this, and realized that unfortunately my experience was not unique, that it was unfortunately all too common.
Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, you haven't had the chance to listen yet. Our guest on that episode speaks about how self-care was promoted when she started having a mental health impact because
Mm,
of the way that the dynamics were playing out at her agency, right? And really how those two things interplay, that, you can start to show the impact of vicarious trauma. And then they say, well, you need to do more self-care. And then it's like, well, you clearly haven't executed the solution. You're not trying to do better. If maybe it's like I'm too overwhelmed to engage in self-care, right? It's like I can't,
mhm.
that's too much for me right now because I'm already at my capacity. My self-care is saying no to this extra thing that you want me to do.
Yeah.
And that isn't really taken so well, that type of self-care. So, a lot of the time that
Oh yeah, yeah. Workers are asserting boundaries and saying, no, I don't want to take that on is like the absolute kryptonite of leadership. Oh, well, we can't have that. So, how do we get you to say yes?
Yeah, I was a chronic yes person for a really long time until yeah, started to say no to preserve myself, save my own life, and did not go well. That's a story for another day.
Fair enough.
So you mentioned that that article you wrote was about a nurse, and I agree. I completely see those parallels, and it makes sense that that was what you chose based on your story. So we also know, right, because we just talked about the five pillars of vicarious trauma, that staff health and wellness is important. And this is something that I think about it as kind of like a shield to go into that work. Like if you're not feeling well, you're not well, you're so vulnerable. You're even
Mm,
more vulnerable to like take that on. And there's other, prior history, there's other things that can make you additionally vulnerable, but certainly if your gas tank is empty and you got to go in
mhm.
and fill other people's, tanks up, there's going to be a problem. So we staff need wellness, but how do they know, or is there any way for staff to know and identify the difference between self-care promotion in their agency for exploitation versus an agency that is just really invested in supporting its staff wellness?
That's a great question. And I think it can be hard to know because I think that the difference between self-care being promoted for exploitation versus kind of in good faith of trying to support staff's wellness is really linked to intention, purpose, goals, and accessibility of self-care, or like if there was a wellness program, if we can call kind of all that an agency would do intentionally planned a program. And I do think though that there's some questions that someone could ask to try and figure that out. So for instance, what policies regarding staff wellness exist? Are there any? I think unfortunately the answer for a lot of organizations is no. And also I think a really important question is, what does turnover look like?
Hmm.
Leaders frequently blame individual workers for high staff turnover rather than the organization taking any responsibility for this, right? That person had a bad attitude, or that person was lazy, or that person hadn't processed their own trauma yet, or that this, that, and the other was the reason why that person, that individual worker, wasn't cut out for the work. They weren't aligned with the mission. I've heard it all. And through personal self-reflection, I've come to realize that like I've done this, that I too have applied for jobs in the anti-violence field, which I knew going in had a high turnover. That specifically, that organization had a high turnover rate, and this position specifically had a high turnover rate. And that I thought that my experience would somehow be different due to the ways that I have and had internalized capitalism. That I had this capitalist competitive mindset that I would somehow be better and thus not have the same problems as the predecessors had had. That I would work harder, smarter, more productively, have a better attitude, etc., etc. And through some kind of radical self honesty and critical reflection, I've come to realize how that mindset perpetuates my own exploitation. That I'm kind of signing up from the get go to be in a position where that's going to be what the expectation is, that be exploited without complaint. And I would also want to know, what is the agency's response when a staff person tells their supervisor or HR that they're burnout? Does agency leadership work with employees to address that, to participate in wellness activities, or is it on the staff person alone to somehow fit into their workload? Go into the training, go into the staff wellness retreat, go into the thing and doing the, whatever. And I've been a part of organizations where it's like, well, yeah, we encourage staff to attend XYZ thing. And then when talking with those staff of like, hey, are you going to be able to make it? Well, no, I have to do this, this, and this. And I've just always kind of wondered, like, what does it actually mean for a supervisor to support their staff in attending the thing? And I think that it requires more than just, I encourage you to attend the thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, yes, because it's like kind of that difference between managing and leading, and this
Mm-hmm.
incredible desire to attend things yourself as a supervisor. I don't know. I used to have trainings where it'd be like great for entry level and a supervisor would show up. But yeah, that willingness to be there and to take the shift and to do the thing so that that person can go. I think advocates that are in those, it's a crisis position, right? It's like, oh, it's crisis work. And I think that's what I've heard for decades is that
Mm-hmm.
indirect service, you're not able to carve out the time because it's crisis work. And that being said, there are some people that are always able to attend. And
Yeah.
so, to your point, what does it really mean to provide that space? My former agency did a whole wellness initiative and had a space, but people didn't have the time in their schedules to go. They're too busy. Or they would want to go and they have something would pop up. And those two things together are such a powerful combination of questions. Yeah.
Yeah, that reminds me of I've been a trainer similarly at an anti-violence organization, and when you said that, I'm like, yeah, you're right. Now that I think about it, it was a pretty common occurrence that at all of these trainings, somehow kind of the same group of staff would always attend all of the trainings, and it and seemed to be kind of unbothered by having fit that into their schedule. And I also think too, like in terms of having been a supervisor and a director, that it often is viewed as like this benefit of promotion that like you don't have to do direct service anymore. And there are so many organizations which recognize the importance of having leaders still do direct service. And I'm definitely on board with that idea that even leaders, all the way up to the top, the CEO, the executive director, that everybody needs to remain connected with what it's like to do the job, and that there should be this like kind of shared like, hey, you want to go to this thing, and so this time I got you while you go do that thing, and then we can figure it out together, and kind of being more proactive and actually supporting staff and being able to do the things if they're feeling like it's unmanageable, they're not sure how to fit it in. And are there opportunities for staff who work different shifts to access wellness activities? I'm thinking of these 24/7 programs, right? We've got overnight staff and weekend staff and people who don't work during business hours, typical Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. But when I think about the bulk of any sort of wellness activity type of thing at any of the anti-violence organizations I've worked at, they were always during business hours, like 99% of the time, which really is an issue of accessibility of can they be offered, are they offered multiple times? And then, our staff, we've talked about this already, of our staff who speak up about burnout or vicarious trauma, are they being ostracized? Are they being pushed out of the agency? How are they being treated? I can remember someone years ago saying they felt like they had a target on their back as soon as they started to complain about what was going on in their working conditions. And it can be really difficult for workers to know a lot of this information when they're first starting at a new organization, because understandably, leaders aren't going to show all their cards regarding this stuff. But I think that these questions can serve as kind of a starting point for how you can start to differentiate between those two things.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think staff can also observe, even if they're not the person that's experiencing that abuse or that retaliation from setting a boundary or from speaking out in some way, they observe it. And you're impacted in some of the research that I was looking over for a post I wrote about abuse of staff in DV agencies, just in workplace abuse in general. Folks are heavily impacted by witnessing the abuse of their peers. And it sets a tone of, you better get in line or this could be
Hmm.
you. And you also have in a lot of places folks that are like the golden child in these really dysfunctional family dynamics, like the scapegoat and the golden child.
Mm-hmm.
So you have people that are getting, like clouded and touted while others are being abused. And how confusing is that for someone that's just entering and trying to get their bearings on what the culture of this agency is like? So I think there's a lot of dynamics for staff to take in, but I think, yeah, that understanding of how you respond. I can't even imagine what a leader would say being asked that question.
How are staff treated? If
How
yeah.
they respond when staff set a boundary.
That's a
Yeah,
great question to ask your interviewer.
yeah,
Potentially, if you are feeling so bold.
yeah. I mean, listen, if it's important, it's important. And so, do you really want to be at an agency where they're like, "Oh, that's not allowed"?
Yeah.
I think in my healing, right, since I've left my former organization, even with myself, you talked about that internalized capitalism. I had to really, you're not going to be able to do this if you don't take care of yourself, right? And it's like, and then it's like, I'm rationalizing my self care with productivity. It's in all of us. And also, like, that I had been like, I need to grind. And then just like, I'm not working for anybody anymore besides me. And I'm still having these things. So it's just, it's really hard, I think, because we're in a system that perpetuates it and we've internalized that. So all these things together make it hard to identify in the first place, get out of, extract it from within.
Yeah, and it's hard too when there's, this constant, like there are so many people who are living paycheck to paycheck, even in the anti-violence field. So many people who are living paycheck to paycheck, who to say no, to set a boundary, to not be exploited, to name what's happening, feels like and very real could jeopardize their employment because of the ways that employers are committed to exploiting their workers. I think a really common phenomena within the anti-violence movement is using this rhetoric around, if you care enough about survivors, if you care enough about this work, you will do whatever it is that we ask of you when we ask you to do it. And especially given the amount of people who are in the anti-violence field who are survivors themselves, that feels like such a mind game to be like, well, I'm showing up in this field as a survivor. Like, and I'll speak of my own personal experience. I'm a survivor, intimate partner violence, of child abuse, of sexual assault, and so much of my impetus of doing this work is to give voice to people who people aren't listening to stand up for people's rights that are being trampled, to show up for people in the ways that I wish people had shown up for me, to show up for people in the ways that I have loved ones in my life who've been victimized in these different ways, to show up for them in the ways that I wish that people had shown up for them, right? That so much of this is so deeply personal to how I view myself and my role within the world, that to call that into question, to say that if I am not exploiting, like participating in my own exploitation, I don't care about survivors. That is such like manipulative, like such a manipulative tactic that is so effective for so many people because of how deeply personal this work is.
It's again so. important to note that you haven't listened to last week's episode because that is what one of the things that our first survivor that we spoke with brought up was the manipulation of this is for the mission. And yeah, the way that that makes you question your own identity and values and beliefs in this kind of grind for the mission. And it also makes me take a step back and say, for the mission, we have to end abuse within our organizations
Mm,
because we can't serve survivors as well as we know that control bleeds down from the top. And so how can we do anything in this field to end violence if it's happening within these same walls? And, also emotional abuse, gaslighting, manipulation, those things are so much harder to see and realize they're happening than physical violence. And not to minimize physical violence, right? But it's,
mhm.
again, I said in this last episode, like the ultimate gaslight of I'm working against abuse and like experiencing it in this place. It's so confusing. I'm also thinking about how you mentioned that like saying no is often met with retaliation and that workers are paid such low incomes. And saying no, having some free time, these are free ways to care for yourselves versus our like, I love Parks and Rec, I love Retta, but treat yourself is
Mhm.
getting people in a lot of trouble, and you don't need to get a pedicure or spend a day at the spa to care for yourself. In fact, those things are a band-aid on a bullet hole when you
Mhm.
really need your workplace to hear your valid concerns about your exploitation. And so, wondering from your perspective, how do we transition from this national culture of self-care that's worker exploitation and capitalism and move to one that's really focused actually on wellness?
Yeah, that's such a big, great question. I certainly don't purport to know all of the answers, and so much of what I know and what I believe I've learned from others who've been thinking about this and talking about this since before I was even born. And where I've landed for now, I've landed there by listening to those speaking about power and the beauty of community care versus self-care, and continuing to interrogate the ways that I've internalized American individualism, capitalism, and oppression. And I think that these are things that we can do as individuals, but I think that this transition includes Americans shifting the value set from it's entirely on me to take care of me and all the things I could ever possibly need to instead we all take care of each other. I think that we need to rid ourselves of the pick yourself up by your bootstraps mentality because this problematic idea that leaning on other people is a weakness, which I don't think it is. I think it takes an incredible amount of strength to say, hey, I need help. Can you help me? And there's so much research out there to support how humans need other humans to be healthy and well.
I really, really resonate with that because I have a tendency to isolate when I am not doing my best, when I'm not well. And so when I'm like trying to heal from all this, I'm like, I gotta isolate. I need to just like go within. And that, that was great. Learned a lot, had a lot, a lot of important introspection. But really, it wasn't until I started re-engaging with community, like the We Deserve Better Project, some other communities that I've become involved with, that I really was able to start to heal. And it just speaks so loudly to what you're saying about this idea of community care, because I was self-caring my face off in isolation and it was not working. I needed, because I'd been hurt by a community, needed to be healed by one as well, right? And I think that's what we know is that if you've been harmed interpersonally, the healing comes from positive, powerful interpersonal connections. So I love that idea about transitioning to more of a community care model.
Yeah, and there are so many groups within the United States who we can all learn from and follow their lead, specifically communities of color, Native Indigenous communities, immigrant communities, who already have these value sets and are practicing community care. And I've come to think about how these interwoven systems of oppression have created a culture in which workers are being exploited, and that self-care is just one of the many tactics that these systems have undermined to use. And I don't think that shifting our mindset about self-care alone will result in this kind of change that we're necessarily talking about, but I think it's certainly a starting point, because I have kind of this mantra that you can't solve a problem that you don't know how to define. And I think that this is part of the equation. So all of this is a long-winded way of saying that we need community to be well. I think it's really powerful you sharing the story of connecting that and then saying like, yes, I was hurt in community and I can be healed in community, that is the intervention. And I completely agree.
Yeah, we really need each other. And even when you feel like that's not what you need, it's actually still what you need.
Yeah, and I think that so much of that, like I think that's so common. I see this especially in my work now as a therapist, where people tend to isolate when they are emotionally struggling or unwell. And that I think so much of the underpinning of that is that feeling of I am a burden to others if I am struggling. And I don't want to put that burden on other people. So let me just remove my presence so as to not burden other people. And I think that it's kind of this domino effect. I think that really comes from this. It is a weakness to lean on other people. It is a weakness to ask for help. And so there's just the further down the rabbit hole you go, it's just like it all points back to the same, these interwoven systems of oppression and capitalism that have really infiltrated the way that we think to such a degree that it's impacting our mental health so significantly.
So, what advice or do you have any advice for advocates that are navigating this, manipulative, toxic, maybe even abusive work environment?
Unionize.
Oh, tell me more.
The collective we always knows more than me. That's another one of my mantras. The United States' labor movement has many, many lessons for advocates on how to navigate an exploitative workplace. And unionizing an anti-violence organization is a labor of love because it is a worker's way of saying that I care. I actually am mission driven.
About
To go
that.
back to that, how about that? I actually am so mission driven. I care about this organization so much, this work so much, survivors so much, that I want to help transform this place into a place where we can all be happy and healthy and safe together. And so I think that if you are listening and you're like, so much of this is resonating with me, so much of this is my experience of being exploited, that doesn't have to be this way. That was such a powerful lesson I learned years ago in some of the anti-oppressive work that I was doing in kind of a different field that I was in, of someone much wiser than me. And it seems so simplistic, but it's really just, it continues to be something I reference because it continues to really resonate with me that all of this, all of everything, the way that everything's set up in this country, oppression and all of these systems that were, founded upon this bedrock of genocide and colonialism, all of it that was built upon that, it was built on purpose. It was built by design. None of this was just how society turned out. Like, none of this is inherent about any human nature or about civilization, that it was all built by design, which means that we can build something different. And that I keep coming back to in all of these moments of feeling hopeless and helpless and powerless. that when people band together, and we've seen it throughout the history of humans across the planet, time and time again, and even more specifically in thinking about the United States' labor movement, we were just talking earlier about how, unions are the reason why we have an 8-hour workday. They're the reason we have FMLA. They're the reason why we don't have children working in factories anymore, why we have child labor laws now. And so I'm continued to be reminded in the power of collective action and in the power of the collective.
Yeah,
So that would be my advice.
I love that. I was really thinking about that at my organization before I left there about what an impact that might have, but who knows? That's on someone that's still there to figure out whether it's the right solution for them. And yeah, I think there's always power in that collective. I think we forget that. And I think for myself and that tendency to isolate, it seems easy to forget because it's like pick yourself up by your bootstraps. You got to do it. But that's maybe the people that know that there's power in the people, like are worried. That's why they want us to be by ourselves, picking ourselves
Mm-hmm.
up by our bootstraps, because then otherwise we'll realize, how united and similar we all are, and really that this mission is one that we're all in together. So, what about for leaders that are realizing, oops, my organization's in trouble? I need to make some changes. Do you have any recommendations for them to envision a different future for this work?
Yeah, I would suggest, I think of so many trainings I've done at different organizations regarding advice that we give any sort of community partner about how they can support survivors. And oftentimes, line number one is start by believing,
Mm,
right? Start by believing what workers are telling you about their mental health, their well-being, and the working conditions. And if you as a leader find yourself frustrated by an employee's complaints, interrogate why that is coming up for you. Ask yourself, how am I feeling right now? Why might I be feeling this way? What does it mean for me to be feeling this way? And interrogate your relationship with power. You have power.
mm,
And question if you're practicing power over or power with. Interrogate the ways in which you are participating in worker exploitation, because that is the system that we are operating with. We can dream of a new way of doing this, and for so many of us, we've not yet dreamt that and made that come to fruition. So I think it is being radically honest with yourself and asking how this is showing up, not if it is showing up. And do you think that people should be so committed to your agency's mission that they sacrifice their mental health and well-being? And I'll tell you, it's probably because you are doing that, and that you think that they should be more self-sacrificing like you are. And let me tell you, my friend, from former leader to leader, you don't have to do that either. Your labor too, if that is your mindset, is being exploited as well. And it requires being pretty radically honest with yourself. This is a constant conversation that you have to have. And actually, former supervisor who I had, she gave me so many tools that I still have in my toolbox. And one question that I carry with me that I'm like on my pulpit telling people about this question, which I think should be part of regular critical self-reflection, not only for leaders, but for everybody, but specifically leaders when thinking about this of like what's coming up for you when people are telling you about what's going on for them. And is whatever it is that your response is and what you're thinking about doing or what you're thinking about saying, ask yourself before you do it, before you say the thing, would I rather be right or would I rather be helpful?
mm.
And you can't be both more often than not. As much as I would love to both be right and helpful, and I think a lot of people can agree, you usually cannot be both. And so I think really it's this constant, like you have to, if you are going to be mission driven, if you are going to be dedicated to this work, and I think that for a lot of leaders they are, because it takes time to become a leader in this movement. You have to demonstrate your commitment to this work through years of service typically to become a leader. And so I think that part of being a leader has to necessarily require you to be really radically honest with yourself and how you're showing up, and the ways in which you're participating in all of this, and asking how, not if. And lastly, for everybody, join the We Deserve Better project.
Yeah. And I want to add that what you were saying is so powerful. And the idea of where, not if, makes me really think about the need to let go of any shame about participation in these systems that are integrated into us. You can go through your process of emotions. In fact, you need to, right? That's really critical. But to do it without a sense of shame, because that's going to inhibit the ability to grow and move through it. And when you highlight where is it showing up in your organization, not if, it really, again, reiterates this idea that it's okay to acknowledge that it's happening, right? Because it's happening everywhere. And the best thing to do now is to not pretend, not shut our eyes again, but to, okay, let's do the work. And it's hard. Yeah. Self-introspection is not easy.
Yeah.
When I left, I did a lot of self-introspection on like, had I been wanting to be right or helpful in some of my ways that I was advocating for staff, and found that like maybe the most helpful thing for me to do is leave at this point, right? If it's, so not functional. So I think all of us can be in a place where we need to just ask those questions about our intentions, because I wasn't leadership in position, but I may have been leadership as far as community. You can have a voice in the community. Well, I want to thank you so much, Jess. Any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap up?
I don't hate self-care.
I was just teasing her.
I just want to kind of jokingly circle back that yes, I encourage each of you listening to do whatever it is that you need to do to take care of you, especially as we think about like working within the anti-violence field and all that comes with that. This is not easy work that we choose to do. And so I hope that you are able to do whatever it is that you need to do, whether that's a bubble bath, whether that's saying no, whether that's going for a walk or quitting or unionizing, whatever it is. I hope that you're able to do it. I hope you're able to access it and that it works for you, because we need folks in this movement, and whatever it takes to keep this movement going, especially in light of everything that the field is facing right now from our current administration and the uncertainty of the future of this field, that we are stronger together, and that can only happen when we are well. So yeah, thank you, Steph. I really appreciate you inviting me to come talk about all of this. This has been great.
Yeah, Jess, it's been so great chatting with you. Thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your perspective on self-care, how it's become a means of exploitation, and all the opportunities that we have to start turning this around, right? We know there's no magic wand to fix it right in one wave, but there are things that workers can do about it. I know it's given me a lot to think about, and hopefully all of you listening out there learned something, were validated in your own experiences, inspired to raise awareness, or maybe all of the above. If you're currently navigating this type of exploitation in your workplace, know that you aren't alone and that you deserve better. Thanks for listening. If you or someone you know is interested in joining the We Deserve Better project or being a guest on the podcast, check out the show notes for details on how to connect. Be sure to tune in for new episodes airing the first Monday of the month, or subscribe to get notified. Remember, anti-violence work is neither anti-violent nor working to end violence. So keep talking and reimagining amongst yourselves.